Well, it's kind of thunder cloudy out there today, so I don't have as much light coming in the window as I usually do. Subsequently, I have a little dab of a reflection issue here, so we'll just have to put up with the light the way it is. I guess I can mount a light on the wall shining on my face or something. One way or another, this one here is a different one than what I usually do. This is about chasing noises and vibrations, and we're going to get into this a little bit, and I hope you guys get something out of it. To begin with, if you've got any kind of, where two pieces are touching each other, you're subject to have a vibration, a noise, a scrubbing, a scraping, or something like that. And this is just a little example right here of what you can see. Like there's a red Mustang that I was working with. So when you got the engine, you know, a lot of times you've got your rubber hoses connected for your power steering lines, and any place where the engine is going to be moving separately from the part where the line is coming from, you're going to have a flexible or a rubber line or something like that. Your exhaust back there where your exhaust header leaves, there will either be a graphite lubricated big gasket back there so that the engine and the exhaust can move separately, or you'll have a flexible link or something like that. These little seemingly useless plastic chambers that you see that are connected to the air inlet tube are basically there to prevent all kinds of woo noises when you're accelerating. I don't know if any of you guys remember when people used to want to make their carbureted engines with the 4 barrels on them and all, like the big blocks, sound better. They would take the top of that round air cleaner and they would flip it upside down so it was pulling air from all the way around instead of just through that snorkel. And whenever you really got on it, you could hear it making this ooh noise, and they really thought that was cool as all get out. But these are resonators, or what they are, and they basically reduce that engine noise. It's not that the vehicle won't run without it, they're just trying to make everything a little quieter and more pleasant, you know, for the driver and all that. And so that's basically what that's about. And they got all different shapes and sizes too. One of the things that can happen with these is if you don't put them back in there the right way, you can wind up with an unmetered air leak and a code for that, you know. All right, so what we got here, you've got noise, vibration, and harshness. That's what your OEMs call that. It would be, you know, NVH. And so noise is defined as an abnormal sound, and vibration is a trembling sensation. It's usually tied to engine or road speed. Harshness is related to the way a vehicle rides. Now, the noises can telegraph from one place to another, and I've actually discussed that on some of my previous presentations on this channel. One time, for example, you might remember me talking about my aunt had this Crown Victoria that when I drove it, I would have sworn that it had a left rear axle bearing going out, and I fought that thing tooth and nail, and it turned out that it was a left front tire, and it was telegraphing somehow to the rear, and everybody that drove that car with me swore it was coming from the left rear, but it was actually the left front tire. So, you know, what you got whenever some people notice every little squeak, hoot, and rattle to the point of where they'll drive you nuts trying to get you to fix all this stuff. There are other people who wouldn't notice anything short of a roadside bomb. You know, they drive along, they hear these noises that just drives you nuts when you drive the car, but here they are driving along oblivious to the fact that whether it's even got a problem or not. Some of them are like that even with the way their car runs. If the car runs terrible, if it's skipping, if it idles rough or something like that, they might not even pay any attention to it. All right, so here's one of the more critical things that you need to do if you're somebody that gets handed work orders where you're trying to fix a squeak or a rattle or some kind of a noise or vibration. The first thing you need to do is you need to make sure that what you're working on is what the customer actually wants fixed, because sometimes you may find a noise that really bothers you a lot and they haven't even paid any attention to it. They hadn't noticed it, they don't care about it. And I ran into a situation back in the 80s where I worked on a noise that was just driving me up the wall for about an hour and a half. Finally got it straightened out and found out when the customer drove the car with me that wasn't even what they were talking about. And so I had to do a bunch more work on it. And they don't want to pay you to fix something that they weren't complaining about. So you better make sure you know what they're wanting fixed and get them to show it to you. Ride with you and show it to you if possible. That's one of the things. You know, you may be working at a shop where the where the management doesn't want you to have any contact with the customer or something like that, you know. But in as much as possible, make sure you know what you're working on. Now this right here was a little story that I told a time or two to my students about this Mustang. He was a fighter pilot in Vietnam. He was kind of retired. He was kind of old and stiff. But he was really fastidious about the way he looked after his car and all that kind of thing. And so he was saying he was hearing a noise coming out of his instrument cluster area. That was the way it was. So I drove the car, and you know, I says, I'm hearing instrument cluster noises, it sounds like. But the shop foreman and I rode this thing together, and he held a jacket that he found in the seat up, holding it in front of him to see if he could, you know, what would block the noise. And when he finally blocked the noise, he was up there at about the top of the windshield area. Whenever he held that jacket in front of him, he didn't hear the noise anymore. And so we took some masking tape and we taped up the trim to see if there was maybe any wind getting caught under the trim and making it buzz and all that kind of thing. That reminds me of this older mechanic that I worked with for a while. He basically took a job at the big shop where I was working at the dealer, and he would go around from one mechanic to the other, and they'd give him their work orders, and he would go get their parts and bring them to him. And I would talk to this guy, and he was just really fun to talk to. And he said whenever he was running a shop, some of these DeSoto automobiles, they didn't have splash shields or nothing under them at the time. And the dynamics of the wind, the way it would get caught up under the fenders of that thing, when you hit about 70 miles an hour, you'd have some sort of a big wind turbulence event that would happen all at once. And he described it like, he said, the best way I can describe it is like there was a covey of quail coming out of the seat of your pants. That was as funny as all get out. But now they put these fender splash shields under there that keep the wind from doing that kind of stuff and all that. But this fighter pilot guy, he was pretty darn cool. We finally got enough time into this thing, and he basically said, look, he said, this is not such a huge problem. He says, let me just take it and I'll bring it back later because I really have somewhere I need to be, because we had worked on it for a while trying to figure out what was making it. We could hear it. I mean, we could hear it plain as day, you know. And so we were trying to figure out what we needed to do to straighten it out. He took the car and he came back and he says, I found out what my problem was. And I said, well, what did you find? He said, well, let me tell you how I found it first. He said, I drove down the road and I had my hand out the window kind of, you know, he just basically, you know, how you put your elbow up on and you hold a rain trough up there, you know, when you're driving, you know, just to have a comfortable place to put your arm. And he says, I noticed that as I was driving and I was hearing that noise, I was feeling it on my hand. He said, so I took my finger and I pointed it until I was feeling it right on the tip of my finger. And I didn't move my hand. He said, I had the window all the way down. At this point, didn't move my hand. I stopped the car and I looked down my finger, and my finger was pointing right at the edge of the bug shield. And he says, and so what I did was, and I saw where he had taken some pieces of fairly thick aluminum and he had formed it and used some Velcro to go from the edge of his bug shield to the hood of the car to keep the end of that bug shield from, you know, catching the wind. And what it was doing was, it was basically telegraphing from that bug shield to the windshield, and it sounded like it was coming out of the speedometer. That's one of them crazy things. Now, here's the progression. Noises have an originator, a conductor, and a reactor. The originator was the bug shield. The conductor was the bug shield, windshield, and then the speedometer, I guess you'd call the reactor. We never saw the speedometer doing anything, but that's where it sounded like it was coming from. But what will happen is, see how this is, I laid that out for you. Usually the reactor is the most noticeably affected component, and it will be something like a sun visor that will be bouncing a little bit. Believe it or not, the frequency at which the sun visor or the seat or the steering wheel bounces or whatever is going to can give you a clue if you go about it the right way, and it's kind of tricky as to what's causing this. Now, there's first, second, and third order vibrations and so on. If you've got a tire, for example, that's got just one bump on it, that's a first order vibration. If you've got a tire that has 2 bumps on it, that's a second order vibration, and 3 bumps would be a third order, and so on. So that's just a sort of a crude way of putting it, but you get the point. If a vibration happens twice during each cycle of that tire, it's a second order vibration. All right, so there are phone apps available. These phone apps are pretty cool. I took both of these screenshots on my personal cell phone. This one here is a freebie that you can get. And this one here, you might notice it gives you amplitude, frequency, and all kinds of stuff, and it gives you a bunch of different things. And that is a pretty cool little tool. Now, I'm going to give you a little more information about what you do with that in a minute, and it's kind of tricky. This one here, I don't know if you've ever worked on one that had a piece of buzzing trim on the inside of the car at certain frequencies and speeds and all. Well, what you can do is you can open your cell phone. I'm going to open a cell phone app right here, and I'm going to show you that. And this is hertz, see? All right, so I'm going to turn that up so you can hear it. All right, see how the hertz, we're going to hit play. All right, now you see that? Now I'm going to drag that across there. See, some of those frequencies are low enough you can't even hear them. But what you do is you get in the car that you're working on that's got this buzz that you can only hear at a certain speed over the engine at a certain RPM, and you take this phone and you Bluetooth it to your radio. And with it Bluetooth to your radio, you dial it up to a frequency level that resonates with that piece of rattle and trim. And you can take that thing and be really slick about finding it right there in the service bay without having to waste your time driving the car all over the place or something like that. But this one here, what you would do is you would get that other one, and I've got that one on my phone too, right in the same spot, and you can do it. See this right here? See how it's doing that? And when I tap on it, tap on the phone, it actually is making that, and it'll give you all the information you need about the frequency and the amplitude and all that kind of thing. So what the long and the short of it is, that's a couple of little freebie tools. Neither one of those tools cost anything, but you can get those from your app store. All right, now let's suppose you have a specific frequency for a vibration recorded at a specific vehicle speed or engine speed, and you're going to use not the frequency generator, but the little measuring tool, the colorful one, of various. You got to know how fast all of the pulleys are rotating, how fast the engine's running, and you got to know which frequency. I mean, which frequency corresponds with each component, including the speed of the drive shaft, the speed of the tires, the speed of the final drive. If you know all that information, and you can calculate it if you know your gear ratios and your tire size and all that kind of thing, this works pretty good. See this TireSize.com calculator? If you'll freeze your screen and capture that and type it in, you'll find one of the coolest calculators for tire sizes. Diameter of the tire, how many revs per mile, at 60 miles an hour, how many times the tire would be rolling per second, and this kind of thing. It's really important when you're looking for vibrations and you're using that phone app. It's going to measure these little frequencies and everything. All right, this is what it looks like when you get it up there. Not only does it have this capability, it also will tell you if you've changed your tires and you put a different size tire on there, it'll tell you what how much your speedometer is going to be off. That's another tab up here. You got to see tire comparison and all that. But that is, I've had that app for a long time available to me, but they keep upgrading it and changing it and making it better. But that's really handy when you're looking for vibrations and you're using that frequency measuring app on your phone. All right, so here's another phone app that costs $100 for Androids. It's specifically made for looking for a vehicle. You put your vehicle in there and all of the information that you've got about your tire size and all that kind of stuff. And whenever this thing picks up on the vibrations, it basically is going to give you an idea of where to look for your vibration. Like if it's spinning at at crankshaft speed or alternator speed, different size pulleys are going to spin different speeds based on whatever RPM you got going there. Now this right here is ATS Professional Tool. Now you might be familiar with ATS. They make some really, really good stuff. And this is a vibration analyzer, and basically it's got these little inputs you can put at each wheel and stuff and around about, and you can basically get a piece of information like this. It's going to tell you, what's your vibration, where your vibration's happening, and so you can kind of get an idea of where you need to go to fix it. Now this is, getting up into some serious money, but if you're a shop owner, and you have to do a lot of vibrations and stuff like that, and you've had some you fought with and lost money on, something like this might be a good tool for you to have. Now you might notice also that most of the time when they have a ground strap going from the engine to the body, they'll have a braided ground strap like these right here, and a braided ground strap is not going to carry noise and vibration like a hard piece of copper wire. And we used to work on some motorhomes, and there was a whole slate of them that came in there for a while, and when they built the motorhome, they just got a great big piece of double-aught cable and put a lug on each end, and the cable was only about 6 inches long, and they put it between the engine and the frame. And what happened was every time the engine torqued, it would bend it a little bit and it would break those lugs, and the way it would manifest itself, you would lose your engine to frame ground, and whenever you were driving the motorhome, as you drove faster, the temperature gauge would go up higher. Then you slow down, the temperature gauge would go back down. I don't know if you duplicate that on anything but a motorhome, but we ran into that on some motorhomes and all. Now some of your fuel injection systems, most of them as a matter of fact, even in GDI, they will typically have a pulsation damper of some kind. Now I told you a few weeks back about using it, you're watching the screw that's under this cover to see if it moves, because it's going to move when you got fuel pressure. Well, this is also here, and it's sort of like bouncing on a trampoline, so that every time the injectors fire and the fuel pulses, it's not causing the fuel injection, the pressure lines to bounce against the bottom of the car and make all that noise and everything. But you'll see those. Now, this was on my yellow Jeep Cherokee, and when somebody would change the oil, somehow they would always take this purge solenoid, and every time somebody changed the oil, that purge solenoid would wound up pushed over here and trapped under that suction line coming out of that doggone, well, excuse me, that was not the suction line, it's the line going from the evaporator to the accumulator. And that little, you might know that these Dodge / Chrysler Jeep suction lines, not suction lines, these evaporative valves go tut 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 tut. They make a noise like that. That's why they're mounted in rubber. Well, when they pull that thing against this, and you started it up, and that thing started purging, it sounded exactly like a really ugly engine knock was developing when the engine was running about the right speed for this to be idling, and you hear that thing going thud 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 thud. You had to scare the living daylights out of the customer. It scared me until I got out there and saw what was going on. But every time somebody changed the oil for me at the college over there, I'd wound up this thing pushed up under that pipe, and I'd have to get it out from under there. Now, when grease is the answer, on this Crown Victoria, you got steering stops. It's not the only one that's got them. Some vehicles are worse to do this than others. But if somebody turns their wheel all the way and they go over a bump while they're got the wheel turned all the way, this steering stop will be against its surface there, and it'll go when it squeaks up and down when they're going over a bump. All you got to do when you're looking under there and you're doing a little service is get some of your red grease or whatever you got in your grease gun, smear it on that thing, smear a little bit on here. They won't be hearing any of that. It's just not a bad practice to do that. Doesn't hurt a doggone thing, and it might keep somebody from claiming that it wasn't like that before or some garbage like that, and coming back. So just everything you can do to keep somebody happy and keep them from having a noise. Like this one here, if you saw one as dry and ugly as that, I guarantee you they're going to hear it sooner or later, only they might not notice it until after you worked on it. All right. This right here is something that I had run into a few times. These fan clutches can do two things. They can either just spin free and never, become viscous and start pulling air, or they can lock up and they can pull air really hard all the time. And whenever somebody sounds, it's really, really noisy, woo, under the hood, whenever the engine picks up speed, or, and they're talking about loss of power and fuel economy and all that, coupled with a noise like that. What you need to do, what I always like to do, is shut off the engine, and you grab that fan and try to turn it with your hands, working this viscous coupling. A lot of times you'll find out that fan's locked up. Back in the day they didn't have these, but they had a little flex fan, that would change the pitch of the blades whenever it spun, so that it wouldn't, use as much power to pull the air and all that. All right, now this one right here was a 2000 Monte Carlo that came to us one day with a nasty whining noise. The owner was absolutely certain must be the transmission, because he had a lifetime warranty that said it, on the transmission, and he wanted us to make sure it was the transmission before he took it back to the transmission shop. And what we did was, it didn't sound like a planetary gear set, which is usually going to be the source of some kind of a whining noise on an automatic transmission. What we found out when we pulled the belts off of it, the noise went away, and we spun all the pulleys, and we saw that air conditioner, that bearing right there. You can buy that bearing for a GM car online for like $17 and just change that bearing if you don't want to change the whole compressor, if the bearing's all that's wrong with it. But anyway, that's what we wound up doing on that one right there. What you got to realize here too, and I'd run into this a time or two, a bad idler pulley bearing or tensioner pulley bearing can sound just exactly like a bad power steering pump. I mean, you'd swear by the way it sounds and the way it changes sounds and all. But the smartest thing you can do if you've got a noise like that is to pull the belt off and spin all of the pulleys. Now, if you've got a water pump that's being driven by the timing belt, and obviously if you're changing the timing belt, it's a good idea to feel of that too, because a lot of times it's just a good idea to put a water pump on it if you're replacing the timing belt anyway, just because you're there. But one way or another, any pulley that's loaded that these belts are spinning is subject to have bearings that have gone noisy on you, and you can fall in a trap if you're not careful. Now, wheel and axle bearing noises can be isolated by swerving from side to side. You can swerve to the left. Remember, when you swerve to the left, it loads the right. When you swerve to the right, it loads the left. This is troubling whenever you work on one of those, and it's like that Crown Victoria I was talking about earlier. You'd swear the noise is coming from the left front or the right front, and it'll be coming from the rear or something like that. And sometimes, if you've got one that sounds like it's got a noisy bearing on the left front, it's not a bad idea to sell them both of those front bearings, just because. If they don't want to buy both of them, you can say, okay, if we replace the one on the left front and it turns out to be one on the right front, because that does happen sometimes. This guy down here that I know that runs a tire store that does a heck of a lot of this kind of work, he says that it just now and again they'll get one that'll smack them around. When you swear in a court of law it was the left front, and it turns out it's the right front. It telegraphs in a peculiar way to where you just really aren't sure what it is. But remember, a tire can make a noise like that too. So rather than changing a bearing first, the smartest thing you can do is go ahead and change a tire. And so, in other words, swap your tires from side to side. Now, tires can be noisy without pulling, and they can pull without being noisy. So that's a wacky thing about tires. So if you have an idea that it might be a tire, move the tire to somewhere else on the car, see if the noise moves with it. That's a smart thing to do too. This was on a 2003 Explorer that had noisy bearings in the rear end, and that's where we got this one here out of. That came out of that vehicle. After we replaced the bearings in the rear end, got the rear end all set up just like it was supposed to be, and all we had to pull that chunk out of there and set up. We put it back up in there, and that thing was still noisy. And we say, we know we had bad bearings. That's one of the things you got to say, I know this. I know for an absolute fact I've got bad bearings. Well, we saw them. They're brittle like this. Then we put the bearings on the outside, which there's CV axles between the chunk and those bearings on the outside. Those bearings on the outside were noisy too. Now we found those with the chassis here. But the long and the short of it is, in order to make this noise go away, we had to change the bearings in the differential, and we also had to change the bearings out there on both sides. Now, how all those bearings managed to die at one time was a mystery. He never had any more trouble with it after we replaced all those bearings, but that was mind-boggling. Sometimes things just don't seem to make sense, you know. You can get these chassis here. I had both of these at the college, the wireless one and the wired one. The wired one will give you better results than the wireless one, and this one's easier to hook up, but I never was happy with the results I got with that. Sometimes there'd be so much interference I couldn't tell what I was hearing. On this one here, and you know, those little, each one of these little clips has got a microphone in it. You got a little box you plug them into, and you can click it from microphone to microphone wearing your headphones. Now we actually have taken a little cord and plugged that little box into a cell phone and Bluetoothed it to the radio so we could listen to those noises on the radio. And that's just handy too, you know, the auxiliary port on the radio. But anyway, this one here with the cords only costs, well, when I bought it was like $150, and that one works a lot better. Now you got to run the cords and you got to tie wrap them so they don't get in the way or get wrapped around anything, and be careful how you route the wires. But that son of a gun right there will help you. That's a chassis ear, they call it. This is also chassis ear, but it's wireless. They also make what they call an engine ear. It's made for listening to engine noises and stuff like that. All right, now, whenever you're hunting noises in the engine compartment, you can get a little old stethoscope, put it on your ears, and make sure you're holding it so that if it gets tangled up in the belts or something, it just jerks it out of your hand and it doesn't pull your head in there with it. But you can take the end off of that stethoscope and use that for a listening pipe. Sometimes there will be a noise coming from an area that won't be, it's not transmitted through the hard metal parts of the engine into that little wand on that stethoscope, but it'll follow that pipe. When my dad used to adjust the carburetors, these dual carburetors that had thumb screws on these old Type 3 Volkswagens, he would take a piece of that paper, you know, foil paper hose that you use for the stoves on your breather and all, and all in Volkswagen Bugs, you know, that for the blower housing. Anyway, he would listen to one carburetor and then another. And I found out that if I hold a piece of hose up to my ear and I can find a problem sometimes that I wouldn't ordinarily be able to find with just listening or even using the probe on the stethoscope. Pretty handy. Now, one time this guy that had been a student of mine, he graduated and was working somewhere else, he was working on his own truck and it beat him up. What happened was he went to AutoZone and bought an alternator because he seemed to have a noise coming from his alternator. So he replaced his alternator. Noise was still there. Now, I don't know if he bought the belt at the same time. This is what the belt looked like that he had on there. And what we did was, we actually, you know, AutoZone checked his alternator and it passed muster on their machine and noise could be heard, so another remanufactured alternator didn't make the noise on the stand, but the noise was still there on the truck. So he replaced the idler, the belt tensioner, and the belt. The noise was still there. Whether he had a belt like that before, whether he had another noise, I don't know. We got into this kind of late. It turned out that the whole problem was that belt was making noise. That kind of belt. Dayco used to make that belt. They don't make it anymore, but there may be some vehicles, there may be some parts houses that still has it in stock. We pull the fan off, and I can listen right here and right here with my stethoscope because the fan was gone, so it wasn't blowing air and trying to cut our fingers off. And it made a horrible noise right there and right there. And that shiny belt with those fluted cuts, we replaced it with a Gates belt that was one of the fuzzy ones. You know, some of the Gates belts are fuzzy with fluted cuts, but them shiny belts with the fluted cuts, that was a disaster and all that. So anyway, what we wound up doing, we put a belt on it and it took care of it. Some parts stores might still have some of those belts in stock. Do not use those belts if you don't want to hear a noise. I saw several other belts just like that, making exactly the same noise that were beating mechanics up. And one of my other students called and said, I put a power steering pump on this Windstar. I don't know why it's making a noise. I said, what's the belt look like? He described it. I said, put a different belt on it, the noise will go away. And he did. And of course, I had written a Motor Age article, I didn't put Dayco's name in there, but when they saw that picture of their belt in the Motor Age article, they called the managing editor and wanted to know why I was trashing their belts. And I was just saying, I've seen it too many times. All I'm doing is reading what I'm seeing. I got nothing against Dayco, but those belts were a disaster. And remember, that's what they look like right there. All right. One time I heard a whistling noise on a Ranger that was a brand new and the guy was waiting to buy it. And but when you give it the gas, you'd make a whistling noise. It was very pronounced under the hood. The new car department guys had already replaced the throttle body gasket and all this because it's where it sounded like it was coming from, and it confused them further because when you moved the throttle, the whistling would change pitch. And so I went over there with a little hose up to my ear like my dad did, a little piece of heater hose, and I went around here and I found it leaking. That check valve on the brake booster was whistling. It had a little crack in it some kind of way, wasn't glued together right, and they put another one of those on there and took care of that noise. Boosting check valve. This police car at the city shop over there in that little town where the college was, that guy said he worked, replaced bearings and all kinds of stuff on one of the police cars that was making a lot of racket. This was right after, back in the early part of the 21st century. And what had happened was there was an American flag the cop had put on the antenna, and it was flipping in the breeze, and it was carrying the noise through the antenna cables down in there where all the VCRs and everything were, and it was driving the cop nuts. And all you had to do was take his flag off of there so that it wasn't catching the wind and rattling, transmitting that noise. It'd be okay. Here was a scrubbing noise on a Cherokee. It would scrub something awful when you were applying the brakes. It would turn. It would like that. You apply the brakes, you wouldn't hear it. Well, that one there just took a new set of brake pads. That's all it took. Sometimes you'll have noisy ones. It can be a fight doing noise, vibration, and harshness stuff. And it's really hard sometimes to get some good flag hours fixing stuff like that because it takes a while to find it. But anybody that has ever driven a vehicle that's got a noise that's making them, go nuts. At the dealership, we used to have to do it because we were a new car dealer, and a lot of times if one was under warranty, the OEM would want you to fix this. And in some cases, if it was written up right, if it was a warranty ticket was figured right, you could get paid a pretty good bit for chasing an aggravating noise. But that's about all I got for you today. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you got a little something out of it. It's kind of an unusual presentation, but I thank you guys for watching my channel, and we'll talk to you next time.